How many times have you heard experiences from individuals and families who are struggling with the challenges of aging, caregiving, the unknowns of health, loneliness, financial worry, and just general overwhelm? I spent 10 years working in the aging sector, hearing these same stories of struggle over and over again. And at the root of it all, no one is teaching us how to plan for aging from a holistic perspective. So welcome to the Ageucation Podcast. This is where you will get the aging education you didn't know you needed. My name is Jess Davis. If you are in your 60s or 70s, or you have parents in their 60s, 70s, or 80s, you are in the right place, my friend. We are all aging. We all want to maintain our autonomy and independence as we age. So let's intentionally prepare our families for the needs of our eldest years. Welcome back to the Ageucation Podcast. Before we get started with today's story, I want to just thank everyone who has supported the launch of this podcast with the first 4 episodes last week. Thank you for listening. Thank you for sharing. Thank you for reaching out to me and providing your encouragement. I'm just so grateful for it all because it really does take a lot of thought and editing and just plain courage to create a podcast and put your ideas out there. So thank you everyone who has jumped on board with me immediately. And to those listening at a future time when I already have a bunch of episodes, thank you also for diving into this podcast and now making it to the 4th episode with me. Hopefully there are many, many more episodes to come, and I'm excited to see how this podcast evolves. But if you haven't reached out to me already, please do. I would love to hear from you and just chat about what you think of the podcast and the stories I'm sharing. So today's story share is a family I heard about quite a while ago. It may have been a case study or something actually that I had read. I can't just remember, but there are elements of this real life story that mirror or parallel so many other families and situations that I've experienced and come across. So the older adult father of the family was in his 70s, and over the years he had spoken proactively with his eldest child about his will and POAs and some of his aging preferences, etc. And although his family and children were all quite close, the father felt that it would be a burden to his other children to lay all this information on them too. And sometimes I find in families in this situation that the older adult parent has this perception in their mind that a certain adult child or multiple adult children wouldn't be able to handle, in quotations, the depth of information about their will and death arrangements, or at the time of doing that planning and documentation, maybe their adult child is going through a difficult season or has things going on within their own family, and the older adult parent doesn't want to feel like they're continuing to pile on another heavy conversation. But then, as you will hear in how this plays out, that's not necessarily the right mindset to have. So, upon this father's sudden death, his eldest child knew many of the plans and arrangements and preferences that the father had. And the eldest child kind of ended up being the champion or led the family through everything. But when the other siblings came to learn and understand the depth of conversation that the eldest child had with their father and not with the rest of them, it caused some turmoil. And there were 3 pairings, I'll call them, of mindset and emotion that the adult children of this man experienced because he had only confided in his eldest child. So, number one, his other children felt hurt that their father didn't have these big conversations with them. They felt like they had been left out of all the planning and preparations of the conclusion of their father's life. And number two, they felt like they had lost an extra level of closure that their eldest sibling did receive, because they could no longer ask their dad why he made a certain decision or why he left something out. He was gone. He died suddenly in this situation, and they never got to ask him all the question marks that they had bouncing through their head. And that will cause serious strain on sibling relationships, because in this situation, again, the eldest child did the deep conversations with their father, and the other siblings may say, well, how come you didn't ask him this? Or how come you let him make this decision? And I know many families, and I'm sure you know some too, where siblings were the best of friends before a parent's death. And then the fallout of the death and the details and the decisions that come after a death just completely turns those relationships upside down. And I've seen many cases where those relationships are never repaired or are completely lost, all because of a severe lack of communication and a deep perception, whether it's true or not, a deep perception of betrayal. So then number three, the added layer that magnifies everything, and that is through navigating all of this and learning that one sibling had more information and understanding than the rest, they're all also grieving the sudden death of their father. And in a deep time of grief, we as humans do not tend to be good at or comfortable with decision making and communicating. So if communication and conversation were things that were missing before the death, I have watched the emotions of grief magnify that in extreme ways. And not to get too negative, but if we're being real, it can tear apart families when thoughts and emotions and past traumas surrounding the family situation are not properly processed and on track to healing. And this is exactly why I am so passionate about guiding families to be proactive and intentional about planning for aging, because that is rooted in conversations. Are you listening to this podcast and feeling like you want more? Like you want to take the next step in learning about age planning and how that could benefit your family? Well, I have the perfect little introduction into my three main frameworks that I use to coach families through being proactive and intentional about their aging journey. So come check them out. The Ageucation Mini-Course. The course is made up of 6 videos that are packed with valuable information and framework explanations to give you a strong visual and create a foundation for understanding how to start being proactive and intentional about planning for aging in your family. Visit my website, nestage.ca/mini-course to learn more and dive in. That's nestage.ca/mini-course. You can find the link in the show notes. So to prevent this kind of situation, or to prevent elements of this situation in your family, you have to start conversations and open up conversations from an intentional and compassionate posture. And I've had people straight up say to me, well, I'm not opening that conversations, or that is a can of worms I am not willing to open. If I ask those questions to my mom, she's going to cry. And I've heard so many closed off and withdrawn responses to what is truly a simple idea of open communication. But here is my very compassionate yet tough love if you are one of those people. You have to figure out how you can get comfortable with being uncomfortable. And that's something that's been said before because it applies to so many aspects of life. But seriously, you have to find the reason to step into discomfort because it's going to create a smoother outcome in the long run. It's like, if I can compare it to my last podcast episode, that couple that I talked about, they were more afraid of dealing with making decisions without one another if something happened to one of them. They were more afraid of doing it alone than they were of opening up the conversation in the present moment and dealing with it all as the cards fall. And that is the reason you have to find. You have to figure out what reason within you is going to push you into being comfortable with being uncomfortable. And I will also say it's okay if it's messy. In fact, it's probably going to be pretty messy conversations at first because most of us have never been taught how to navigate tough and emotional conversations. Because in our Western society, we shove things down until they eventually explode out of us, or we just keep living in a discouraged or depressed state, having never dealt with them at all. And that's kind of, it's a conversation for another day, but it also has generational patterns, right? Like if we don't learn this type of open communication from our own parents, then we likely don't have it. And then it's our parents and us both not being open to open and clear conversation. And that's where a lot of this comes from, like this lack of comfort. But we're all human and we all have our own thoughts and perceptions and opinions. And it is a learned skill to be able to communicate with someone by bringing your own ideas to the table while also still listening to someone else's ideas. And then together as a team, piecing together the most optimal action plan and outcome. And when we learn how to do that in a calm and intentional way, that's when we find understanding among one another, and that's when we give compassion to people, and that is when we start to become primed to heal when there is past trauma involved. And that is exactly what I am here to guide families into. I coach people into opening up these conversations within their families or their care team. And that creates the foundation and continues to build the structure for age planning, which then creates an optimal aging experience for, most importantly, the older adult themselves, but also the rest of their family, because the effects and outcomes of one individual's aging impacts their whole family. But I think I'll leave it there for today. I hope that gave you lots to think about and ruminate on. Maybe you have made connections from this story to people in your own life. And my hope is that you will give, or this will give you more ideas to be able to process what you're dealing with or what a friend is dealing with, a family member, whoever it is. But I'll leave it there, and I will catch you back here for the next episode next week. Thank you so much for listening to this episode of the Ageucation Podcast. I have 3 reminders before you go. Number 1, go check out the show notes for any resources or links that I mentioned in this episode that may have piqued your interest. Number 2, please share this episode with a friend whom you think it would bless, because in order for more families to benefit from my age planning resources, I need listeners like you to spread the word. And number 3, I would love to hear from you. Email me with your thoughts on this episode or suggest a topic you'd like to hear on a future episode. Find my email in the show notes. And remember, we're all aging. Aging is the same as living, and it is a privilege to live and to age.